Hey everybody, we're going to talk about the end of Descartes Meditations. So the last three, we've talked about the first three, and so now we're going to get into the end of it and see where Descartes goes with this. I want to say to everybody, let me move this. I want to say to everybody that we should recall the trajectory of the meditations, where Descartes started, where he's going, and he's pretty good about this in the text, sort of summing up the path so far. It's almost as though with every meditation he sort of starts over. He recalls where he was in terms of his epistemological journey, and then he begins again. And so here in meditation 4, he's just come out of this proof for the existence of God that seems to show that he can trust his clear and distinct ideas. And so let's just have a look at what he says here. By the way, in this particular lecture, we're going to be paying very close attention to the text. Put this down here. We're going to be paying very close attention to the text. So I encourage you to get out the reading and sort of follow along somewhat. I mean, you can follow along on the screen as well. I'm using Jonathan Bennett's rather liberal translation. By that, I just mean he interpolates additional things into the text. He sort of updates the language to 20th century language. For our purposes, I think it's fantastic. It makes the text much more readable for students. If you have the alternative translation, or an alternative translation, like the Crest translation, this guy right here, that's fine as well. Just it's a good translation too, but expect some modest differences. Okay, so beginning of meditation 4, we see Descartes saying at the very top of this passage here, it says, "Now, when I consider the fact that I have doubts, which means that I am incomplete and dependent, that leads to my having a vivid and clear idea of a being who is independent and complete. That is, an idea of God. And from the mere fact that I exist and have such an idea, I infer that God exists and that every moment of my existence depends on him. This follows clearly. I am sure indeed that the human intellect can't know anything that is more evident or more certain. And now that I take into account the true God, in whom all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge lie hidden, I think I can see a way through to knowledge of some other things in the universe." So there's some big claims here. In particular, he says, indeed, that the human, I'll mark it here. He says that the human intellect can't know anything that is more evident or more certain than that God exists and created it. Nothing could be more certain. Not the fact that you're listening to this lecture, not the fact that 2 + 2 = 4. Nothing, he says, can be more certain. And then we get into sort of the heart of this meditation, which is about where error comes from if God is not a deceiver. And Descartes says, to begin with, and this is really the core of the argument, he says, to begin with, I see that it is impossible that God should ever deceive me. Only someone who has something wrong with him will engage in trickery or deception. That someone is able to deceive others may be a sign of his skill or power, but his wanting to deceive them is a sign of his malice or weakness, and those are not to be found in God. So there's something about this idea of an infinite substance that prevents it, as an infinite substance, from engaging in trickery or deception. Right? That somebody is able to do it is a sign of their power, but their wanting to do it would be a sign of malice or weakness. So, sure, God is able to deceive us if he wanted to, but he doesn't. That's the idea here. All right, well, if that's true, why am I ever wrong about anything? if God wouldn't deceive me and God made me in the world, why would I ever possibly be wrong about even where my car keys are? And so this is Descartes wants to answer this objection. You can see it's on page 18 of the Bennett translation. But remember, we're right at the beginning of meditation 4. It says that would settle the matter except for one small difficulty. What I've just said seems to imply that I can never be in error. If everything that is in me comes from God, and he didn't equip me with a capacity for making mistakes, doesn't it follow that I can never go wrong in my beliefs? And he quickly says, well, I mean, that's absurd, because I know, frankly, I'm often wrong, right? Like, I thought there was more iced tea in the fridge, and there's not. I mean, just to take a sort of silly example, but when you think about the things that cultures have been wrong about, the shape of the earth, for example, clearly we make mistakes. And that's what Descartes says next. Well, I know by experience that I'm greatly given to errors. But when I focus on God to the exclusion of everything else, I find in him no cause of error or falsity. In looking for the cause of my errors, I am helped by this thought. As well as having a real and positive idea of God, a being who's supremely perfect, I also have what you might call a negative idea of nothingness, that which is furthest from all perfection. I realize that I am somewhere in between God and nothingness, or between supreme being and non-being. So somewhere in between the infinite and nothing, right? So in a way, he's just saying again that he's a finite being. So now, a positive reality that I've been given by the supreme being contains nothing that could lead me astray in my beliefs. So he's been created not with flaws, like positive traits that are things that are wrong with him. He says, I make mistakes, not surprisingly, because my nature involves nothingness or non-being. That is, because I am not myself the supreme being and lack countless perfections. So this is a crucial line here. So error is not something real that depends on God, but is merely something negative, a lack, a defect, something that you're missing. It's not something that you possess, but something that you don't have. So it's not a feature of you in the positive sense, but it's something that you're missing. There is therefore nothing positively error-producing in the faculty of judgment that God gave me. When I go wrong, I do so because the faculty of true judgment that I have from God is in my case not free of all limitations. That is, because it partly involves nothingness. This is a very medieval way of philosophizing, but it's actually, you can find it in Plato as well. But there is this core idea that in Plato that that evil is a kind of lack of good, right? Or at least this is an idea that that these folks talked about a lot, and likewise in the Middle Ages. So human beings are perfectly are perfect just as they are, right? This is sort of required by the idea of a perfect God. So they're perfect just as they are. So why do we screw stuff up all the time? Well, it's because we're not infinite beings. It's because we lack all kinds of stuff. Yes, we have reasoning, but we're not perfect reasoners, right? So we would be perfect reasoners if we were supreme beings, but because we're not, we can't expect that. So for the kinds of beings we are, we're just fine. But we're not the supreme being, and therefore we lack certain things. And so it's natural for us to make mistakes. Now you might think, wait a minute, if God's this all-powerful being, what the hell, Descartes? Couldn't he have just made us so that we didn't make mistakes? And Descartes, he says, yeah, okay, that's an important objection. Now here we're over on the next page again of the Bennett translation. So he says here, you can see right where the page starts, my errors are the only evidence I have that I am imperfect. When I look more closely into these errors of mine, I discover that they have two cooperating causes, my faculty of knowledge and my faculty of choice or freedom of the will. My errors, that is, depend on both A, my intellect, and B, my will. So it's not that we get things wrong, not just because we have an imperfect intellect. We get things wrong because we want to extend our knowledge beyond those limitations. He says, the intellect doesn't affirm or deny anything. Its role is only to present me with ideas regarding which I can make judgments. So strictly speaking, it doesn't involve any error at all. There may be many existing things of which my intellect gives me no ideas, but it isn't strictly correct to say that I am deprived of such ideas, as it would be if my nature somehow entitled me to have them. I can give no reason why God ought to have given me more ideas than he did. Just because I understand someone to be a skilled craftsman, I don't infer that he ought to have put into each of his works all the perfections he can give to some of them. Right? So the core here is this idea that our judgment's this perfect faculty, our intellect is this perfect faculty. There's nothing wrong with it. But because we're free, we make judgments about what the intellect presents that we shouldn't make. So why did God give us this freedom? Remember, the question I was raising before was, why didn't God just create us as incapable of making errors? And here you start to get the answer, right? We would be robots if that were the case. So God gave us some kind of free will, and that free will, because it's free will, can't force us to conform to, can't force our judgments to conform to the world. Now, Descartes actually, this is the position he's ultimately advocating, but he's going to get a little more subtle about it. He says, and this is page 20 of the Bennett translation. Let me move the screen here. It says, so the power of willing that God has given me, being extremely broad in its scope and also perfect of its kind, is not the cause of my mistakes. So it's not that I just have this ability, nor is my power of understanding to blame. God gave it to me so there can be no error in its activities. When I understand something, I undoubtedly understand it correctly. Well then, where do my mistakes come from? Their source is the fact that my will has a wider scope than my intellect has. My will has a wider scope than my intellect has. And you can see a little bit of text here that our translator, Bennett, has interpolated to help us get what Descartes is saying here. He says, so that I am free to form beliefs on topics that I don't understand. Right? We essentially, we want to know more than we're capable of knowing. And we want to know more even without sufficient evidence. And so sometimes we just make these sort of, I'll call them decisions, but I will say it might be better to say our will moves us in such a way, or we allow our will to move us in such a way as to claim knowledge of these things. And we do this, he says here, instead of behaving as I ought to, namely by restricting my will to the territory that my understanding covers, suspending judgment when I'm not intellectually in control. I let my will run loose, applying it to matters that I don't understand. In such cases, there's nothing to stop the will from veering this way or that, so it easily turns away from what is true and good. That is the source of my error and sin. So in other words, don't throw shade at God for your mistakes. You're to blame, right? That's what Descartes is saying here. It can't be a Deus Deceptor either, right? Because God's goodness rules out the possibility of this Deus Deceptor. But it turns out God's goodness also, in Descartes' mind, also rules out the possibility of God deceiving us. So God wouldn't let the Deus Deceptor or deceiving demon do it. But God also wouldn't do it. And this, I think, is Descartes just getting into some nuances here, and I wanted to point it out. So you say, well, you're free. But why couldn't God just give us choices or allow our will to just extend over things where we're not making decisions, where we couldn't go wrong, right? So maybe like there's no absolutely correct choice of favorite ice cream. There you could exercise your free will. You choose, chocolate or whatever, strawberry, vanilla, whatever. But there you could exercise your free will without the possibility of making a mistake. So here's what Descartes says. He says, finally, right here, finally, I must not complain that God consents to the acts of will in which I go wrong. What there is in these acts that comes from God is wholly true and good, and it is a perfection in me that I can perform them. Falsity and error are essentially a privation, a deprivation, something lacking. And this privation has no need for help from God because it isn't a thing, a being. Indeed, when it is considered in relation to God as its cause, it isn't really a privation, but rather a mere negation, a lack. That is, it is a mere fact about something that is not the case. It does not involve the notion that it ought to be the case, right? So again, he's making this claim that he was making on the previous page here in response to this consideration. We are to blame. Don't complain that God gave you a free will. In fact, the will itself is, if you examine it, look at it, there's nothing wrong with it. What the problem isn't with the will itself, it's in the way that it's utilized, right? Because you can restrain the will, it's free, but you don't do that, and therefore we wind up making these kinds of mistakes. And you could say, well, God could intervene and stop us when we make those mistakes. But what Descartes is saying here, and it's a little confusing, but the idea is God couldn't come in and stop you from making those mistakes, because the mistakes themselves come out of your nature as a finite being. The mistakes themselves are not, they're examples of privation, of not having complete being, of not yourself being a supreme being. So there's this intimate connection between that and our errors. Okay, so at this point, you get what's typically called the Cartesian circle. And there's been a lot of ink spilled over the Cartesian circle. I'll just present the view that what Descartes has done in these first 4 meditations is just presented a circular argument. That is, the very thing he wants to prove, he has to assume in order to prove it. That's what it means when we say something's a circular argument, right? That nobody would accept your conclusion who didn't already accept it, the premises. Now, there are subtler versions of this where some people say, well, it's not circular in a bad way. It's more like Descartes throws out a hypothesis about clear and distinct ideas and shows what would have to be the case for those truly to be trustworthy, and then discharges the assumption in a way that, so in logic, we would call this a hypothetical proof. Okay, so let's just walk through the circle again. And this should all be familiar, but we're just pointing out that the reasoning may involve a circle. At the beginning of meditation 3, we say, okay, we can trust our clear and distinct ideas. Remember, in the Bennett translation, they're vivid and clear is how he's described. So rather than saying distinct, he calls them vivid, right? Which is probably vivid is closer to our everyday use of that term in English. So clear and distinct ideas, then we say we can trust. We can trust them because that's exactly how we knew the cogito. If we trust those clear and distinct ideas, we can get to these principles of reasoning, right? That you can't get something from nothing, and that a thing must be sufficient to create whatever effects it has. A cause must be sufficient to create effects, sometimes called the principle of sufficient reason. From those, Descartes argues we get the existence of God because we have an idea of God as an infinite substance. The idea had to come from somewhere, and the thing that created the idea had to be sufficient to create it. The only thing that fulfills that description, as we talked about in the last lecture, the only thing that fulfills that description is an actual infinite being, God. Because God is perfect, and here we get into meditation 4, God, while it's possible that God would deceive us, his perfection rules out the idea that he'd want to, because deception is no kind of perfection. It goes against the nature of a perfection. And likewise, this shows that there cannot be a deus deceptor, right? Because if God is perfect, God wouldn't allow there to be a deus deceptor. And God also wouldn't deceive us about things we perceived, here we go, clear and distinctly. Or, vividly and clearly. This means that we can have knowledge of the world, because our clear and distinct ideas, they capture truths about the world, truths about motion, truths about gravity, things like that, right? Also truths about us, truths about God, etc. So here we seem to have a foundation for sciences in God. God seems to guarantee the truth of our clear and distinct ideas. So remember, we started with this clash in Descartes' time between the new science emerging in folks like Copernicus and Galileo, and later sort of exemplified by Newton, and then we get, on the other hand, religious orthodoxy. The church had been the center of knowledge for many, many centuries and had established beliefs that were doctrine that seemed to clash with the scientific results coming out in Descartes' time. Well, now Descartes says, no. Look, we can trust this insofar as this new science is based on our clear and distinct ideas. We can trust those because they're guaranteed by God, by the nature of God. So that's a huge, huge claim. And again, he's claimed to show this in a very short run of pages, right? But the worry is we've got a circle, right? The only way he can make any of this coherent is to get rid of this deus deceptor argument. And the only way he can do that is to show that there's a God, a good God, a perfect God, who wouldn't allow there to be a deus deceptor. But the only way he can show that, or at least the way he does try to show that, is through assuming that these clear and distinct ideas are trustworthy. But remember, at this stage, we've just shown that there's a cogito in meditation 2. Remember, in meditation 3, he says, well, I'll take whatever's clearly and distinctly presented to me, I'll take that to be knowledge. But remember, we said, wait a minute, it seems like he's changing the rules here. Because couldn't a deus deceptor put the idea that I can trust clear and distinct ideas in my head? If so, I can't make that move. So Descartes wants to show that you can make the move, but the only way that he can do that is to rely on some of these clear and distinct ideas, the principles of reason that he has, the idea of God he claims to have. So it seems like we get a big circle. Again, there are kind of subtler readings of it where it's presented as what's sometimes called a transcendental argument. You take a thing and assume that it exists and then show the conditions that make it possible. Right? So that would be a more charitable or generous reading of the text. But on the surface, at least, it looks like we've got, a circular argument. So from this, Descartes moves into meditation 5. And, it's another question. Why does he think if he's proven the existence of God already, why is he doing it again? Right? Like, if the first proof was good enough, why do you need a second one? Well, remember, these are meditations. And so he's in each of these 6 instances, he's starting where he left off and thinking through things again. And so you do get some overlap in them. He's not writing as a straight up treatise. So one of the things he's doing in Meditation 5 is thinking about this idea of perfection. Remember, he's got an idea of a perfect being, infinite substance, and it's clear and distinct. And so he's engaging in this further meditation on its nature. And remember, strictly speaking, when we talk, and this is what the slide says, when we talk about proving God's existence, or when we talk about God at all, this is not necessarily the Christian God or the Jewish God or the God of Islam or the God of any of the denominations within these religions, right? Descartes is thinking of, well, he may personally have in mind the Christian God, but what the arguments show is not that the God described in the Hebrew Bible or in the Christian Bible is the one he's talking about. That doesn't follow. He doesn't get any of the, like, nothing about Jesus of Nazareth comes out of any of these arguments, okay? So, I mean, he may want that to come out, but he doesn't think that it does, and we shouldn't either. Okay. So Descartes presents in Meditation 5 a very, very famous argument. It's called the ontological argument. And the original version of the argument comes from the Middle Ages, from a monk by the name of Saint Anselm. This is the page where he presents the argument. Now, I'm not going to dive into this text here. There's a lot of interpolation. You see all of this stuff here. This is a note that Bennett, our translator, has put in. So just remember that Bennett interpolates stuff into the text, places stuff in, explanatory stuff into the text sometimes. I think it's very helpful. And you know, I've had good results using this text with students. But do recall that that's happening. So I'm gonna just mark this page for you guys, 24. Have a close look at it, but I'm gonna present analogous arguments. Okay, Descartes is kind of riffing on earlier arguments that were well known. So here's the ontological argument from Saint Anselm. Now get ready for your head to hurt. Maybe preemptively take some Tylenol or something, aspirin, whatever. Okay, premise 1. The concept of God is the concept of the most perfect being. And Anselm says it's the concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought. It's a strange turn of phrase, that than which nothing greater can be thought. And it's English grammar that makes it seem so strange, right? It's the idea of a thing that nothing can be greater than. Of the greatest thing, that than which nothing greater can be thought. The than which is what throws people off. We do that, like, you know, when we say things like, to whom is this letter? Instead of saying, who's the letter to, we say, to whom. And that's what they're doing here. Than which is like, to whom here. Nothing greater can be thought than. That's the idea we're talking about. The greatest possible thing. And so we have this concept of God that is the concept of a greatest possible thing. Notice that according to this premise, even the atheist has that concept. I mean, what does the atheist deny? The atheist denies precisely that there is such a thing as a being that corresponds to this concept. They don't need to deny the concept. They deny that there's anything in reality that corresponds to the concept. So it seems like everybody should be able to accept this premise. Second premise. If God lacked existence, we can imagine a being more perfect than God. If God lacked existence, we can imagine a being more perfect than God. So the idea here is that somehow the very first premise entails a being that exists, because if you imagine two things, one of which has actual concrete existence and one of which doesn't, well, which one is more perfect? Which one can you think is there one of them that would enable you to still think of something that's greater than that thing? And the claim in the argument is that, yeah, if a thing doesn't exist, any version of it that did exist would be greater than that thing. I mean, remember, if you think about the perfect pizza, whatever you think is on it, right? The perfect pizza. Now, what would be better, that perfect pizza in your head or the actual one right here, right now? Now, you may be tempted to say, well, the actual one will let me down because the perfect pizza is perfect, you know. But that's true. I think that we romanticize stuff, even pizza. But I think the point here is a different one. When we're saying imagine the perfect pizza as an idea and imagine it in reality, we're not saying imagine some dim reflection of the perfect pizza in reality. We're saying imagine the actual perfect pizza, not one that lets you down, right? You imagined it would be this crisp on the bottom and it's not. But the actual perfect pizza, everything about it is perfect. Is the one that exists greater than the one that's only in your head? It seems like clearly yes, right? The thing actually existing has more reality, more being than the mere idea. So we've got this idea of the greatest being, idea of God. If we think about that idea as a being, as not corresponding to anything, as a kind of myth, then we can think of an idea of an even greater being that we then compare to this non-existent being, except the one that we imagine is one with being that does exist, doesn't exist. So what's greater, a God that doesn't exist or a God that does? Well, pretty clearly, even if you're not sure about the pizza case, pretty clearly a God that does exist is more perfect. That is, has more reality, has more being than one that doesn't. So 3, if God is the most perfect being, it is impossible to imagine a being more perfect than God. And that almost seems true by definition, I think. Right? So when we imagine this perfect being, we have to imagine that being as existing. Otherwise, we can imagine a more perfect one. And therefore, God exists. Now, let this sink in what's happened here. We start with the idea of God. And then the notion is from the very idea of God, you can derive God's existence. From the very idea. Concept of a God is concept of a perfect being. If God lacked existence, you could imagine some being that was more perfect. But if God's the most perfect being, it's impossible to imagine a being more perfect than God. And that entails, given premise 2, that entails that God must exist. It's an elegant argument. Who knows if it works? But it's a very elegant argument and very interesting argument. Notice its proof depends entirely on reasoning about these particular concepts. It doesn't depend on experimental data or anything like that. There's another version of it to show you real quick. And again, it's the same basic idea, but sometimes it's helpful to just put the same argument in different words. So the idea of God is the idea of a perfect being. Perfection means lacking nothing appropriate to a thing's nature. If God lacked existence, God would not be perfect, therefore God exists. Now, one thing that this formulation of the argument kind of brings out, think again of these perfect pizzas. So if I say a perfect pizza is a pizza that lacks nothing, I would then have to say that it should have, in addition to the normal toppings you would put on a pizza, it also needs to have dirty gym socks, used toilet paper, nuclear reactors, gasoline, right? Because perfection means lacking nothing. So that means everything would have to go on the pizza for it to be a perfect pizza. That's silly. So here we have to say perception doesn't mean lacking nothing at all. It means lacking nothing appropriate to a thing's nature. And so likewise, you would say the same thing about God. Perfection doesn't mean that God consists in the same stuff you put on a pizza. It doesn't entail that the idea of God must include the idea of evil, right? If perfection means lacking nothing, oh, well, God's got to have evil. No, because the claim is that perfection means lacking nothing appropriate to a thing's nature. And for medieval philosophers, as well as for Descartes, evil is a kind of lack of good. It's a kind of deprivation. So God lacks nothing in terms of being. God is complete being and therefore cannot contain evil. Insofar as things move away on that scale of being, move away from the infinite substance on that scale of being, evil introduces itself. Again, this is just part of this worldview. I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about, but our main reason for bringing it up here is to understand what Descartes' doing. So what are the things appropriate to God's nature? Well, we've said that God is the idea of a perfect being, so he has full or complete being. If God lacked existence, God would not be that perfect being, and therefore God exists. It's the same basic argumentative move. But here, though, in Meditation 4, we see Descartes moving from, Meditation 5, we see Descartes moving from a consideration of where error comes from to a further consideration of God's nature and our evidence, rational evidence for God's existence. I'm going to move into Meditation 6 here. And there are just a couple things I want to point out about this. So we're going to go through it kind of quickly. What Descartes claims to accomplish in Meditation 6 essentially is the discovery of an immaterial soul. Now, soul in these texts, think about it as the self. He thinks he's discovered a self or a consciousness or something that could exist apart from the body. And the argument that he gives is an argument that's based on conceivability. He says, if you can conceive of two things as existing apart from one another, if you can conceive of them, not just say the words, like there are things you can't conceive of, square circles. Go ahead, try. I mean, you can't. But if you can conceive of a thing, then that thing is possible. Doesn't mean likely, doesn't mean probable, it's possible. So let's look at this text. He says, first, I know that if I have a vivid and clear and distinct thought of something, God could have created it in a way that exactly corresponds to my thought. So the fact that I can vividly and clearly and distinctly think of one thing apart from another assures me that the two things are distinct from one another. That is, that they are two, since they can be separated by God. Never mind how they could be separated. That does not affect the judgment that they are distinct. So notice that. Descartes' not saying, our souls can come in, ourselves, our consciousness can come out of the body and re-enter it or anything. I mean, he's saying it's possible. It's logically possible. And it may be that only God could separate soul from body. In fact, later in the text, when he's talking about his idea of himself, earlier in the text, when he's talking about his idea of the self, we've already seen this. The body's the first thing he thinks of. He says, well, it can't be that for these various reasons. But it's the first thing that comes to mind. So Descartes doesn't really think the body is incidental to our existence. It isn't at all. It's crucial to the kinds of beings we are right now. But he's saying that it's at least possible that God could separate mind from body. And it's possible, or some other force could do it, right? And it's possible because we can conceive of the two things as existing apart. Now you might say, wait a minute, no, I can't. I can't imagine the two things, mind and body, existing apart. Of course they can't. That's, but I would point out that as soon as you think of a corpse, you've done it. There's a body existing without a mind. So we're good to go on that, right? In terms of the separation in that way. Now, what is a mind existing apart from any body? Well, I don't know. That's tough. But in a way, I think Descartes would say, well, you've already imagined it. We did this in meditation too. As soon as you thought about the cogito, the thinking thing, you had already imagined, conceived, as it were, thought outside of the body. So you can conceive it, the two things as existing apart. And therefore, it's possible that they, in reality, might exist apart. Not right now at this moment, mind you, but at some point in the future. That they're two commingled kinds of things. There's physical stuff and mental stuff. We don't know exactly how they work together. And this is a difficulty for the view, but we can clearly and distinctly perceive them as, or think of them as apart, and therefore it's possible that they exist as two different kinds of entities. This, by the way, is called dualism. I'm sorry that my handwriting looks so childish when I'm right with this little marker. I probably just should have put this up on another slide. Dualism. Dual as in two. Ism as in it's a doctrine. Dualism. There are two fundamentally different kinds of things. Minds, mental stuff, immaterial stuff, and bodies. Bodies not just as in our bodies, but as in material things. Descartes calls them extended things. And all that means is things that have spatial dimensions. They extend in dimensions. Sorry. So this is the introduction of Descartes' famous dualism. Here at the very end, he says, all right, I can know the world, I can know matter, provided that my discussions of that are grounded in clear and distinct ideas, and I don't let my will extend beyond my intellect. And now he says, I can know that it's possible for the soul, for consciousness, whatever term you want to give this thing, this immaterial part of me, the cogito, I can know that it's possible for it to exist outside of the body, without the body, without matter. It's possible for that to happen. He doesn't. That's enough, right? He says the conceivable is the possible. Oh, look, I did put it in the slide. I forgot about that. Oops. Right, so this is just a reminder of what we were just saying, that mind and body are two distinct kinds of things, both capable of existing independently of each other. They're capable of it. Descartes thinks of mind and body as fundamentally intertwined. His point here is not to make light of the role of the body. He's actually pretty subtle about this in a number of places. It's surprising. Surprising because so many people assume he has this kind of Mickey Mouse view of the relationship of the two. And he doesn't. I mean, in fact, Descartes thinks, for the most part, the mind acts through the pineal gland. And the reason he thinks that, he's got an argument. He says it's one of the parts of the brain that's not split. It's not duplicated in both spheres, right? So you'll have one part in the left and there's a mirror sort of image of it in the right. And he says, well, that would make the soul kind of bifurcate. It would make it split in two. So if the soul or consciousness or whatever is working through the brain, it's got to work through something that's not split in that way. It's a kind of clever guess, kind of clever argument for where to locate it in the brain. But remember, here in the meditations, the claim is not that, we're minds floating around in bodies. He says mind and body are capable of existing with each other. It's possible. But he seems to indicate, he doesn't come right out and say this quite, but He seems to think that this is something only God could do. So check this out. This is as vividly as it teaches me anything. My own nature teaches me that I have a body. That when I feel pain, there's something wrong with this body. That when I'm hungry or thirsty, it needs food and drink and so on. So I shouldn't doubt that there's some truth in this. Nature also teaches me through these sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and so on, that I, a thinking thing, am not merely in my body as a sailor is in a ship. Rather, I am closely joined to it, intermingled with it, so to speak. So he says he's not merely in his body like a sailor in a ship. It's not that there's a little soul sitting up in your pineal gland pulling the levers. He says here that he's intermingled with it, so that it and I form a unit. If this were not so, I wouldn't feel pain when the body was hurt, but would perceive the damage in an intellectual way, like a sailor seeing that a ship needs repairs. When the body needed food or drink, I would intellectually understand this fact instead of, as I do, having confused sensations of hunger and thirst. These sensations are confused mental events that arise from the union, the intermingling, as it were, of the mind with the body. So the mind is kind of, put it in a kind of funny way, it's dispersed through the body. Although, I mean, maybe it shouldn't be. I mean, the brain is dispersed through the body in the sense that your peripheral nervous system are the axons of neurons that are, I mean, your neurons stretch throughout your body. I'm sure you guys probably know that. So the central nervous system's the brain, the peripheral nervous system stretches throughout. Descartes is thinking about our experience. He says, yeah, look, if I were just to mind these things like pain, they wouldn't feel so urgent. Okay. So again, this is just to remind us that he doesn't think of us as kind of ghosts in the machine. Although, you know, in various places, he does seem to indicate that he thinks of bodies as operating according to mechanical laws, including human bodies. So this is a big question that arises out of Descartes. If these two things are really separate, mind and body, how the heck do they interact? The philosopher Daniel Dennett at one point calls this he uses this example. I think he calls it the Casper problem, but we're going to call it the Casper problem. You know, Casper, the friendly ghost. So he can pass through walls, but he can also like bump into shit. So what's up with that? Like, you pick a side. Either you can't, the physical stuff that gets in your way doesn't affect you and you can pass right through it, or it does affect you and you knock into it. Now, I've talked about this before with students, and some of them have seen this old movie, Ghost, where like part of the plot point is that a ghost can like interact with stuff in the world by concentrating really hard. I'm calling bullshit. Like, that doesn't solve the problem. Like, if Casper decides if he can fly through walls and he decides he's going to knock something over, what the hell happens? Why doesn't it just pass through the thing he's going to knock over? He just thinks about it and poof, magic? No. I want to know the causal mechanism that's in place to let immaterial stuff engage with material stuff. I mean, if I want to take a drink of this coffee, big gas station coffee, my hand has to be able to grip that cup, exert a force, and move it. Not my mind, my hand. Right? So that's a pretty clear indication of how causal interaction works. Something with mass, something else with mass, they interact in some way. Well, my mind, not my brain, my mind, the mental stuff, has no mass because it's immaterial. So how the heck does it ever cause anything? How the heck does it even, if I make the decision to move my arm like this, how the heck does it even make that happen if it's immaterial? That's the problem. It's sometimes called the problem of mind and brain interaction, causal interaction. And here we see also in the final meditation, Descartes kind of spelling out what's different about mind and body. He points out the mind is not divisible. I mean, you may think of things like people with personality, dissociative identity disorders or something like that, but even that wouldn't really falsify this. Their mind is not divisible in the sense that each one of those different identities experiences itself as complete. The identity itself manifests and then sort of hides, right? So like it's like different people taking turns at being a non-divisible mind, if that makes sense. Yeah, every body is by its nature divisible, but the mind can't be divided. And then he's pointing out here, he's starting to say a little bit about how the mind and the brain interact. And he knew 400 years ago, the mind isn't immediately affected by all parts of the body, but only by the brain, or perhaps just by a small part of the brain. So he's in a way, I mean, even though he winds up arguing for the possibility of an immortal soul, he's really interested in the physiology of consciousness too, the biology of consciousness. So at the end of the meditations, here we are at the end of it. Remember, we started with this rigorous skepticism. But at the end, what can we know? Well, we can know that there's a good God and that we are not deceived about our clear and distinct ideas, or at least this is what Descartes says we can know, okay? We may find the arguments unsatisfactory for all kinds of reasons. But Descartes thinks we can know that there's a good God. We don't know if it's a Christian God, a Muslim God. We don't know any of that. A Hindu God even, but they would have to be the most powerful one, right? That than which nothing greater can be thought. We know there's a good God. We're not deceived. We can know that the sciences that are founded on our clear and distinct ideas really describe the world, right? Because God wouldn't let us be deceived about those. We can know that God infused our bodies with an immortal soul, right? Because if God had to create the idea of God, if God's the idea of a perfect being, then God created everything. If we're a mixture of soul, of minds and body stuff, mind and body stuff, God would have had to have created that too. And so what you can see here by the end of the meditations is that Cartesian skepticism it's methodological. So sometimes you'll see people say Descartes was a skeptic. And that's true only in the limited sense that he starts out using skepticism as a method. If you want Descartes' final view of things, he's not a skeptic at all. Moreover, he thinks he's defeated skepticism. It's only methodological. Remember the full title of the meditations. It's Meditation of First Philosophy, in which are proved the existence of God and the soul, right? And he says, so that right there in the title, he says where he's going. So is Descartes a skeptic? Only methodologically. That is, he uses skepticism just as a method. It's also worth saying here, just reminding you that Descartes is we'll say more about this later, but he's a rationalist. So where does our knowledge of the world come from? Well, you can see this in his method. It comes from reasoning. We get eventually to sensory experience. We can know the sensory world, Descartes thinks, but that knowledge is fundamentally grounded in the activities of reason, in our uncovery of, or discovery, I should say, of clear and distinct ideas. The next philosopher we're going to read, Hume, is going to contest Descartes' epistemological picture. And we'll see what he has to say about what we can know about the idea of the self and about the idea of God, as well as these arguments. We'll see what he has to say as we proceed. All right. As always, please post in the discussion boards any questions you might have and reflections you might have on the stuff we've covered. That'll be all for now.